The table goes quiet the way it always does right before someone decides to be cruel. Diane sets her fork down and waits for it. Maybe you could sell the leftovers, her sister says, swirling her wine, smiling like she's being generous. Charity case discount. A few quiet laughs ripple around the table. Her mother doesn't laugh, but she doesn't stop it either, just a small nod, the kind that says she's not wrong. Diane used to flinch at that nod. Tonight she doesn't. She looks at her plate, at the centerpiece her mother spent too much on, at the family that stopped seeing her the day she stopped being useful to them. None of them know about the folder sitting in her car. None of them know what's already been signed, sealed, and quietly set in motion, a deal that, in 3 weeks, will make every person at this table obsolete. 2 years earlier, Diane was the kind of daughter mothers bragged about at church and family reunions. She'd built her real estate career from nothing, cold calls, open houses on weekends, learning the market block by block until she could read a neighborhood's future before anyone else saw it coming. By 38, she had the career, the reputation, and the corner office with her name etched into the glass. Her mother loved telling people about it. My daughter, the agent, she'd say, like Diane's success was something she'd personally engineered. It wasn't affection, not really. It was reflected glory. Diane figured that out slowly, the way you notice a draft in a house she thought was sealed tight. Her mother's warmth always arrived attached to a number, a closing bonus, a magazine feature, a client who happened to be someone important. Take the number away, and the warmth went with it. Her sister, Renee, performed support in public and resentment in private. Renee had married into money but never built anything of her own, and she wore that emptiness like a chip she sharpened every time Diane walked into a room. Must be nice, she'd say, about the new car, the vacation, the promotion, 3 words that always sounded like a compliment and never were. Diane used to brush it off. Looking back, she should have paid closer attention to how much her sister needed her to eventually fail. Then there was the house. Diane and her husband, David, bought it the year her business doubled, a wide, sun-soaked colonial with a porch big enough for the holidays the family insisted on hosting there every year. It became more than a home, it became a stage. Her mother photographed it for her social media like she'd built it brick by brick. Renee made backhanded comments about the size of the kitchen while using it more than her own. David's parents, who'd never fully approved of Diane, softened considerably once they saw the address. The house didn't just shelter the family, it justified her to them. For a while, Diane let herself believe this was love. She mistook the attention for affection, the visits for closeness, the photos for pride. She didn't yet understand that she'd built a version of herself that her family could be proud of from a distance, one that required constant performance and zero room for failure. She didn't know yet that the moment the performance faltered, so would everyone standing in the audience. That moment was closer than she thought. The first blow came on a Tuesday, disguised as nothing unusual. David came home late, said he had a work dinner, and Diane believed him because she'd never had a reason not to. It took 3 more months of late nights and vague explanations before she found the messages, 18 months of them, with a woman from his office whose name Diane had heard a dozen times without ever attaching meaning to it. The affair itself almost wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she found underneath it, credit cards she didn't know existed, maxed out on hotel rooms and gifts. A second loan against the house, taken out without her signature on a form she later learned he'd forged. By the time the divorce papers were filed, David had already disappeared into his new life, leaving Diane to untangle a financial mess that wasn't hers to begin with, in a house that suddenly felt like a debt she was renting from her own life. She told herself she could absorb it. She had her career, the one thing that was unambiguously hers, built without his help, his name, or his money. That belief lasted exactly as long as the market did. The downturn hit 6 weeks later, the kind that real estate agents whisper about for years afterward. Listings sat. Buyers vanished. Commissions that used to arrive like clockwork dried up overnight, and Diane watched the income that had once impressed her entire family shrink to something that could barely cover the mortgage David had quietly doubled. She kept working. She kept smiling at open houses where nobody came. And then the third blow arrived, the one that would do more damage than the other two combined. A deal Diane had spent 4 months building. A commercial property sale that would have been the biggest commission of her career, enough to dig her out of everything David had buried her in, collapsed 2 days before closing. The buyer pulled out, citing financial irregularities in the paperwork. Irregularities Diane hadn't created and, if she was honest with herself, didn't fully understand. Her business partner on the deal, a man named Ray who handled the financing side, blamed her instantly and loudly, to the board, to the brokerage, to anyone who would listen. He said she'd missed disclosures. He said she'd mismanaged the escrow timeline. He said it with the kind of certainty that made people believe him without checking. Diane tried to explain that the numbers Ray had given her didn't match what the bank later produced. Nobody wanted to hear it. It was easier to believe a woman going through a messy divorce had simply dropped the ball than to question a man with 20 years in the business and friends on the licensing board. Her license was suspended pending review. The review never seemed to move forward. The damage was done the moment the accusation became public. Diane sat in her car outside the brokerage on her last day, holding a banker's box of nothing important, and ran the timeline over and over in her head. The numbers. The dates. Ray's sudden urgency to close before anyone looked too closely. None of it added up to incompetence. It added up to something else, something deliberate, but she had no proof, no time, and no one left in her corner to help her find it. She drove home that night already bracing for what was coming next. She just didn't know yet how cold it would be. The dinner happened 2 weeks after the suspension became public knowledge, the kind of small-town public where everyone's mother somehow already knew. David's parents, who'd fawned over Diane for a decade, greeted her that night with a politeness so brittle it was its own kind of insult. No questions about how she was holding up. No mention of the divorce, the house, any of it. Just a careful, practiced distance, the way people treat something they've already decided not to be associated with anymore. Renee was less careful. "I heard you're doing real estate consulting now," she said, not quite hiding her smile. "Is that what we're calling it?" Diane didn't answer. Renee filled the silence the way she always did, turning a knife with a smile still on her face. "Maybe you could sell the leftovers. Charity case discount." A few people laughed. Not loud, just enough to sting, the kind of laughter designed to look accidental. Diane looked at her mother, waiting for the version of her that used to step in, the one who'd once threatened to leave a Thanksgiving early because someone made a comment about Diane's weight in college. That woman didn't show up tonight. Instead, her mother gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, the kind of nod that didn't need words to do its damage. "She's not wrong." That nod hurt more than anything Renee said. Renee's cruelty was at least honest, predictable, something Diane had learned to brace for years ago. Her mother's silence was a different kind of betrayal, quieter, and somehow final. It told Diane everything she needed to know about where she stood now that she had nothing left to offer. Nobody asked if she was okay. Nobody asked what really happened with the deal, or whether the story they'd all heard secondhand was even true. They'd already decided which version of Diane they were keeping, and it wasn't the one sitting at their table. She finished her meal in silence, nodded politely when spoken to, and left early without making a scene. In the car, she let herself feel it for exactly as long as the drive home took, the humiliation, the loneliness. The particular ache of being unwanted by the people who were supposed to want you regardless. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she'd made a decision. She wasn't going to convince them she deserved better. She was going to make sure she never needed them to believe it. Diane took a job at a property management company that wouldn't have looked twice at her resume 2 years earlier, answering calls, scheduling maintenance, doing the kind of work she used to assign to assistants. The pay barely covered rent on the small apartment she moved into after selling the house, the one her family had once treated like a monument to her success and now treated like evidence of her failure. She stopped showing up to family events. Stopped answering Renee's texts, The ones that arrived just often enough to remind her she existed but never asked how she was doing. Her mother called twice in the first month, then not at all. The silence from their end didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like clarity. What she didn't stop doing was thinking about the deal. On her lunch breaks, she pulled old emails, old financial statements, anything she still had access to from her last weeks at the brokerage. She cross-referenced dates. She found a financing document with numbers that didn't match what she'd been given to present to the buyer, numbers that had been altered after she signed off on them, not before. Someone had changed the paperwork after it left her hands, then pointed at her when the buyer's lawyers found the discrepancy. It took her another month of careful digging, and one conversation with a former assistant who still owed her a favor, to find the name attached to the shell account that had quietly profited from the deal's collapse, Ray. Renee's husband. Diane sat with that for a long time. Ray had been bleeding money into a bad investment for over a year. She remembered Renee mentioning a rough patch once, in the careless way people mention things they don't think matter. The commercial deal Diane built would have exposed the financing gap Ray had been covering up. Killing the deal, and pinning the blame on her, made the problem disappear and made her disposable in the same motion. What made her sit very still, staring at her kitchen wall for nearly an hour, wasn't Ray's betrayal. It was the realization that her mother and sister had almost certainly suspected it. Renee's lifestyle, the vacations, the renovations, all of it ran on Ray's money. If Ray went down, so did the version of Renee everyone admired. They hadn't defended Diane that night at dinner not because they believed she was guilty, but because believing it was more convenient than risking what Ray's money paid for. Something in Diane shifted permanently in that hour. The hurt didn't disappear, but it stopped being the loudest thing in the room. In its place was something colder and far more useful, clarity about exactly where she stood. And exactly what she'd need to do to never stand there again. She wasn't going to waste energy proving her innocence to people who'd already chosen comfort over truth. She was going to build something they couldn't ignore, couldn't laugh at, and couldn't control. And when the time came, she wasn't going to need a single one of them to believe her. She just needed them to need her. The plan started small enough to be invisible. Diane opened an LLC under a name that meant nothing to anyone. No version of her own name, nothing traceable to the family who'd stopped looking for her anyway. She used what little savings survived the divorce as a down payment on her first property, a foreclosed duplex 2 towns over, ugly enough that no one else wanted it, structurally solid enough that she knew exactly what it could become. She did the work herself where she could to save money. Learning to patch drywall from late-night videos, negotiating contractor rates down to numbers that barely worked, selling furniture she didn't need to cover a permit fee. She spent her evenings as a property manager's assistant and her weekends as an investor nobody knew existed, and for over a year, those two lives never touched. The duplex sold for a profit that felt enormous and was, in the larger picture, small. She rolled it into the next property. And the next. She got better at spotting distress before it hit the open market, pulling pre-foreclosure filings, talking to homeowners before agents ever got the listing, using every skill she'd built in her old career, except now there was no Ray to hand the numbers to, no board to answer to, no one to blame her if something went wrong. She still saw the family occasionally, a birthday she couldn't avoid, a funeral that required her presence. At one gathering, Renee made a comment about Diane's little admin job in front of new in-laws, loud enough to make sure it landed. Diane just nodded and let it pass, the same way she'd learned to let a contractor's lowball insult pass when she needed the deal more than she needed the win. She'd stopped needing these people's approval the way she once needed oxygen. Now their underestimation was simply useful. It kept them from looking too closely at where her money was actually coming from, or asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. 18 months in, her LLC quietly held 6 properties, a cash reserve larger than anything she'd had during her successful years, and a reputation, under a name nobody at that dinner table would recognize, as a buyer who could close fast and ask no questions. She'd built something real this time, brick by brick, without an audience and without applause, exactly the way she should have built her life the first time. She kept watching one filing in particular, the one she'd been tracking for months, a refinance on her parents' house, taken out quietly to help cover a temporary cash flow problem nobody in the family would name out loud. She had a guess about what that problem actually was, and a guess about whose bad investment was really behind it. She didn't act on it yet. She just kept watching, and kept building, patient in a way she'd never been allowed to be before, because for the first time in her life, no one was watching her fail, and no one needed to know she was about to win. The pieces came together faster than Diane expected, once she knew what to look for. The refinance on her parents' house had gone through a small private lender, the kind of outfit that specialized in buying distressed debt nobody else wanted to touch. Diane recognized the lender's name immediately. She'd used them once herself, early in her rebuild, before she had the capital to skip the middleman. A few calls, framed carefully through her LLC as an acquisitions inquiry, were all it took to learn the lender was looking to offload a small portfolio of underperforming notes. Her parents' refinance was one of them. She didn't hesitate. The note was a strong asset wrapped in a family's quiet desperation, exactly the kind of opportunity she'd built her entire comeback on. She bought it through a holding company 2 layers removed from the LLC, the paper trail clean enough that even a determined family member poking around would hit a wall of shell names before finding her. Renee's loan was easier to find and harder to look at. A business loan, taken out against the equity in her and Ray's home, the kind of last resort people reach for when they're trying to keep a lifestyle alive that's already collapsed underneath them. Diane recognized the desperation in the paperwork the way she recognized it in herself, 18 months earlier, signing for that first ugly duplex. The difference was that Diane had been building towards something. Renee had been borrowing to maintain an illusion. Sitting with both notes in front of her, her parents' home, her sister's last financial lifeline, Diane felt something complicated settle in her chest. Not triumph exactly. Something closer to inevitability. She hadn't gone looking to take her family's home out from under them. She'd gone looking for distressed assets, the way she did every week, and the math had simply led her back to the people who'd discarded her. There was a strange justice in that. She hadn't engineered their downfall. She'd just stopped looking away from it. She held both notes quietly for weeks, deciding what, if anything, to do with them. The decision was made for her 3 weeks later, when an invitation arrived in her inbox, her parents' 40th anniversary, a milestone celebration being thrown, fittingly, at the house Diane technically now controlled. Renee had organized most of it, clearly hoping to use the event to re-establish the family's image. And, Diane suspected, to take one more shot at her in front of an audience. The invitation included a line that almost made Diane laugh out loud: family only, no outsiders, no drama. She RSVP'd yes. And for the first time since the dinner that started everything, she didn't feel dread walking into a room with these people. She felt something closer to readiness. Whatever Renee was planning to say to her that night, it wouldn't land the way she expected. The ground underneath all of them had already shifted, and only Diane knew it yet. She picked her outfit carefully, packed a folder she'd been preparing for exactly this moment, and drove toward the house that had once been her family's proudest possession, now quietly, legally, hers. The party was exactly what Diane expected: expensive flowers, a band nobody asked for, Renee working the room like she was running for office. Diane stood near the edge of it, holding a glass of wine she had no intention of drinking, watching her mother accept compliments about a marriage she'd spent most of describing as exhausting in private. It didn't take long for Renee to find her. "Surprised you came," Renee said, scanning Diane's outfit with the kind of judgment she'd perfected over a lifetime. "Things going better for you? Or are we still doing the admin job?" A few relatives nearby laughed, the same practiced laughter from that dinner 2 years earlier. Diane smiled, calm, unreadable. "Things are going fine, actually." "Fine," Renee repeated, amused. Must be nice to have such low standards. This was the moment, and Diane knew it the second she felt the folder's weight in her bag. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even change her tone. Actually, she said, I wanted to talk to you and Mom about something. Privately, if you don't mind. Something in her calm unsettled Renee more than any argument could have. She led Diane and their mother into the study, already irritated, already bracing to dismiss whatever Diane was about to say. Diane set the folder on the desk and opened it without ceremony. This house, she said, was refinanced 8 months ago. The note was sold to a private holding company 2 months after that. She slid the paperwork forward. I'm the holding company. The room went silent in a way Diane had never heard it go silent before. Her mother picked up the paper with shaking hands, scanning the name at the bottom, the one that traced back, eventually, unmistakably, to her daughter. That's not possible, Renee said, but her voice had lost its certainty. Diane pulled out a second document. And the loan you took out against your house, the one Ray doesn't know you used to cover his investment losses? Same buyer. She let that sit in the room without raising her voice once. A family lawyer, present for the party's logistics, was called in within the hour to confirm what the paperwork already made clear. Legally, financially, undeniably, Diane held the leverage now, on both properties, on both debts, on both women who'd once decided she wasn't worth defending. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed the folder, looked at her mother, and said quietly, I'm not here to take the house from you. I just wanted you to know whose hands it's actually in now. Then she walked out of the study, back into the party, and let the silence behind her do the rest of the talking. Diane had been sitting on the evidence against Ray for almost a year, debating whether it was worth the effort to expose him at all. Walking out of that study, watching her mother's hands still shaking around the paperwork, she made her decision. Ray hadn't just sabotaged a deal. He'd cost her a license, a career, and 2 years of her life that her family had let her spend believing she'd failed on her own. He didn't get to walk away clean simply because she'd found a quieter way to win. The following week, Diane sent everything she'd gathered, the altered financing documents, the shell account records, the timeline that proved the numbers had been changed after she signed off on them, to the state licensing board and, for good measure, to a financial journalist who'd built a reputation digging into exactly this kind of fraud. It moved faster than she expected. Within a month, the board reopened her case, and this time, the paper trail spoke for itself. Ray's name surfaced publicly soon after, attached to a fraud investigation that swallowed both his real estate dealings and the shell accounts he'd used to bury his losses. The investment he'd been hiding for years collapsed entirely, taking his business, his reputation, and most of Renee's remaining financial security down with it. Diane's suspension was quietly reversed. No apology came with it, board reviews rarely include those, but the reversal itself was its own kind of statement, a official, undeniable record that she had never been the problem. She watched the fallout from a careful distance, the way she'd learned to watch everything now. She didn't call Renee. She didn't reach out to offer comfort or say I told you so. She simply let the truth do what the family had refused to do for her, speak plainly, without protecting anyone's comfort over it. For the first time since the night of that humiliating dinner, Diane felt something settle fully into place. Not joy exactly. Something steadier. The story everyone had told about her, careless, failed, a charity case, had quietly, irreversibly, come undone, replaced by a truth she hadn't needed to raise her voice once to prove. The call started within days. Her mother first, voice thinner than Diane remembered, asking to talk things through. Then Renee, oscillating between apology and old habits, still managing to sound aggrieved even while asking for help. Diane let every call go to voicemail for a while, not out of cruelty, but because she'd learned the hard way that giving people immediate comfort rarely taught them anything,